Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about Xiaomi and Huawei joining forces, with both the 3nm chip and a new computer operating system emerging at the same time. China has taken strong countermeasures against the US blockade of Chinese AI chips, stating that anyone who cooperates with the US in targeting Chinese companies will be subject to Chinese counter-sanctions. Although China and the US have reached a preliminary tariff agreement in Geneva, China remains tough on the US's bullying behavior and refuses to give an inch. The most prominent recent anti-China move by the United States has been targeting Huawei's Ascend AI chips. On the same day that China and the US reached a preliminary tariff agreement in Geneva May 12, the US Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security issued an announcement revoking some of the advanced computing semiconductor export controls implemented during the Biden administration. However, at the same time, it released new guidelines for AI chip export controls, stating that the use of Huawei Ascend chips anywhere would violate US export control regulations. Afterwards, China lodged strong protests with the US through multiple channels. Subsequently, the US adjusted the language in its export control guidelines to warn the industry that using advanced Chinese computer chips, including certain Huawei Ascend chips, carries risks, but China still refused to accept this. China strongly opposes the US's unreasonable actions to block Huawei Ascend chips. Foreign Minister Wang Yi criticized the US for attempting to suppress Chinese chips. On May 20th, during a meeting in Beijing with Qinghua Kang, president of the Asia Society, he said that recent high-level economic and trade talks between China and the US have made progress, once again, demonstrating that equal dialogue, mutual respect, and properly addressing each other's legitimate concerns serve the interests of both countries. However, the US's recent attempts to completely block Chinese chips and suppress China's legitimate right to development are blatant acts of unilateral bullying. And on May 21st, China's Ministry of Commerce took further action. The Ministry of Commerce stated that the United States is attempting to ban the use of China's advanced computing chips worldwide, including certain Huawei Ascend chips. The US measures are a typical example of unilateral bullying and protectionism, seriously undermining the stability of the global semiconductor industry and supply chains, and depriving other countries of the right to develop advanced computing chips and high-tech industries such as artificial intelligence. China believes that the United States is abusing export controls to contain and suppress China, violating international law and the basic norms of international relations, seriously harming the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises, and endangering China's development interests. China emphasized that the US measures are suspected of constituting discriminatory restrictions against Chinese companies. Any organization or individual that implements or assists in implementing the US measures will be considered in violation of the anti-foreign sanctions law of the People's Republic of China and other relevant laws and regulations, and will be held legally responsible. China is closely monitoring the implementation of the US measures and will take firm actions to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests. The implication from the Ministry of Commerce is that whoever follows the US export control guidelines to sanction Huawei Ascend chips will be subject to counter-sanctions by China. The anti-foreign sanctions law mentioned by the Ministry of Commerce was enacted in 2021. Article 3 of this law stipulates that if a foreign country, in violation of international law and the basic norms of international relations, uses various pretexts or its own domestic laws to contain and suppress China, imposes discriminatory restrictive measures on Chinese citizens or organizations, or interferes in China's internal affairs, China has the right to take corresponding countermeasures. Article 4 stipulates that the State Council may place individuals or organizations that directly or indirectly participate in the formulation, decision-making, or implementation of discriminatory restrictive measures against China on a counter-sanctions list. In other words, if anyone follows the instructions of the US Department of Commerce and claims that Huawei's Ascend chips pose a risk and then imposes discriminatory restrictive measures on Ascend chips, China will impose counter-sanctions on those organizations or individuals. Since the United States can exercise long-arm jurisdiction and demand that the whole world boycott Huawei's Ascend chips, China is responding with its own countermeasure. Whoever listens to the US and boycotts Huawei's Ascend chips, China will impose counter-sanctions on them. This increases the cost for other countries or organizations that act in concert with the US to boycott Huawei's Ascend chips. Let's do a brief summary. First, China is taking a very firm stance. If the US Department of Commerce does not withdraw its export control regulations restricting Huawei's Ascend chips, then I will impose counter-sanctions on those who cooperate with you, and the US will have to pay the price. Second, China's confidence in taking such a tough stance also indirectly proves that, during the previous Geneva negotiations, it was the US that blinked first. The US is more anxious than China, so China is even less afraid to play hardball with the US, because the US doesn't have many moves left to counter-sanction China. Right now, China is making breakthroughs one project after another. On May 19th, there was a stream of good news about domestically produced chips and computer operating systems. Xiaomi's CEO Lei Jun officially announced that their system-on-chip, UNG-UN, designed using second-generation 3nm process technology, will be released. This is the first time China has successfully achieved a breakthrough in 3nm chip design, filling the gap in our country's advanced chip design capabilities. According to Lei Jun, Xiaomi's chip research and development has taken 10 years. Since 2014, they began exploring system-on-chip development, and after encountering setbacks, they shifted their focus to developing smaller chips. After years of technological exploration and accumulation, Xiaomi restarted its system-on-chip development in 2021, committing to a strategic investment of 50 billion yuan over 10 years. After 4 years, they finally created the UNG-UN chip. This is a major innovative breakthrough, making Xiaomi the fourth technology company in the world after Apple, Qualcomm, and Taiwan's MediaTek capable of independently designing 3nm process mobile system on chips. On the other hand, the company that previously released its self-designed 5nm chip for Huawei also, on the same day, launched its self-developed Harmony OS computer equipped with the Harmony operating system. The central processing unit it uses is now 100% independently developed and controlled. At the same time, Huawei launched the world's first laptop equipped with the Harmony OS operating system, the Huawei MacBook Pro, as well as the world's first Harmony OS foldable computer, the Huawei MacBook Pro Extraordinary Master. This marks a major breakthrough for domestically produced computer operating systems in the personal computer sector. Huawei's executive director, Richard Yu, admitted that Microsoft's Windows and Apple's macOS operating systems have dominated the global computer OS market for many years, but Huawei has persisted in doing what is difficult yet right. Now, with the official debut of computers equipped with the Harmony OS operating system, Huawei has achieved independent control over the entire chain from the kernel to the application ecosystem. This not only offers the world more choices, but also breaks the decades-long market monopoly held by Microsoft and Apple in the United States. From computer and mobile operating systems to high-end chips, these key areas in which China has long been marginalized or even blocked are now quietly being revitalized with the rise of domestic alternatives. In particular, the history of chip development is essentially a chronicle of China being contained for nearly 30 years. The chip blockade imposed on China by Europe and the United States actually began in the last century. In 1996, the United States led the establishment of the Wassenaar Arrangement on export controls for conventional arms and dual-use goods and technologies, excluding China from the more than 40 member countries of the agreement. The Wassenaar Arrangement did not officially list the countries under control, but verbally included Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and Libya as targets of regulation. Member countries can refer to the Common Control Principles and Lists to independently decide on the measures and methods for implementing export controls, and independently approve their own export licenses, and on this basis, notify other member countries of relevant information. However, in practice, this notification arrangement is completely controlled by the United States. According to the Wassenaar Arrangement, when a country intends to export certain high technology to China, the United States can even directly intervene. For example, when the Czech Republic planned to export passive radar equipment to China, the United States put pressure on the Czech Republic and forced it to halt the transaction. Under the Wassenaar Arrangement, an export control framework was also established for key areas such as semiconductor equipment and materials. By 2018, when Trump launched a trade war against China, he also began targeting Chinese technology companies like Huawei. The United States kept tightening restrictions under the Wassenaar Arrangement, strictly limiting the export of chip equipment and technology to China, and even claimed that without access to advanced American chips, China would never be able to achieve anything in high technology. Back then, Huawei suffered heavy losses as a result of US sanctions. The US restricted all high-end chips, prohibiting their sale to Huawei and even forbidding foundries from manufacturing chips designed by Huawei. Huawei's overseas markets were almost completely wiped out. After 2018, the United States further imposed a comprehensive blockade on chip manufacturing and foundry sectors and restricted high-end lithography machines from entering our country, establishing an all-encompassing technological barrier. However, what the US did not anticipate was that this kind of suppression actually ignited our country's fighting spirit. While the United States focused on cutting-edge process technologies like 3nm and 5nm chips, Chinese chip companies started from the basics, seizing the market and making major moves in the field of mature process chips at 28nm and above. It is estimated that by 2027, China will occupy 83.9% of the global market for mature process chips and will have built a complete industry chain from raw materials to packaging and testing. China is fully capable of independently controlling the mid and low-end chip sectors. As for mid to high-end chips, Chinese companies have not stopped making progress either. Before the United States imposed sanctions on Huawei, after launching the Kirin 28nm chip in 2014, Huawei continued to make advancements, raising its chip manufacturing process to 10 by 2017. In 2018, it even launched the world's first 7nm process chip, which led the way in both performance and energy efficiency, becoming the flagship benchmark chip for Android phones. At that time, the chips designed by Huawei were mainly manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan. If it weren't for the US sanctions, Huawei would have surely continued to advance its chip design step by step toward FIVM 3nm and even 2nm processors. However, the US sanctions cut off Huawei's path to outsourcing chip manufacturing to overseas foundries. Previously, Huawei made a comeback by having domestic chip manufacturers produce its 7nm and 5nm chips. This time, the Harmony OS computer released by Huawei uses the Harmony X90 chip, which is based on a FIVM process. It features high performance and low power consumption, with AI computing power increased fourfold. Therefore, due to being limited to domestic foundries, Huawei has not designed a 3nm chip. Xiaomi's smartphone system on chips now adopt a diversified supply model. Chips designed by Taiwan's MediaTek hold a dominant position, with their system on chips using as much as 63% of Xiaomi smartphones, making them the primary chip supplier. Meanwhile, chips designed by the American company Qualcomm rank second, supplying about 35% of Xiaomi's chips, mainly serving Xiaomi's mid to high-end models. Qualcomm's top-tier chip, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, is also manufactured by TSMC using a 3nm process. Judging from the specifications, Xiaomi's latest self-designed Surge Wound chip is a true powerhouse when it comes to hardware configuration. Its design breaks away from the mainstream flagship chip architectures of 1+3+4 or 1+4+3, which are the traditional 8-core structures. By increasing the number and frequency of the mid-cores, it aims to find a new balance between performance and energy efficiency. Preliminary leaked test data shows that Xiaomi's Sejun chip is even more powerful than Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 chip. It is widely speculated that this Xiaomi chip is most likely manufactured by TSMC. To sum up, first, whether it's Huawei's HarmonyOS computers equipped with the brand new Harmony operating system, or Xiaomi's self-designed 3-process Sejun chip, both represent major breakthroughs by Chinese companies in breaking the technological monopoly of the United States. Second, ever since the United States introduced a Wassenaar arrangement in 1996, China's chip and other electronics-related industries have been under constant blockade. This ongoing blockade certainly brings tremendous pressure, but at the same time, it also unleashes powerful momentum within China's electronic technology industry. The successes of Xiaomi and Huawei are just typical examples of this. In the future, more breakthroughs from Chinese companies are sure to follow.